The girl in the crate. The Stevedore's hook caught the corner of the crate at 20 minutes past 2, in the way hooks do when a load is improperly balanced, or when the stated weight on the manifest is not the actual weight inside. The crate rocked. Nobody gave it further thought, except the ship's purser, Mr. Percy Stout, who had been staring at the crate's entry on his clipboard since 9 o'clock that morning. Percy Stout would be dead before 5. By the time anyone understood why, the manifest would already have been quietly rewritten, by someone who didn't realize the rewriting had been witnessed. Hello, and welcome to Midnight Pages. I'm David, your host, here with you from Ohio. Before we step onto the Quay and into the smell of tar and salt and the particular nervous business of an English harbor in 1937, I want to ask you something. Is there a secret you believe is worth keeping, not because it protects you, but because it protects someone else, someone who cannot protect themselves? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. Tonight's story is about exactly that question, and about the particular human cost of the answer. Now, the tide is in. The SS Aldgate is in port. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Waybill. Halverton was a working harbor of the modest, useful kind that existed in quantity along the Devon coast in the years before the war rendered such distinctions beside the point. It had a fish quay, a cargo dock, a customs house of Victorian construction that had retained its dignity by the simple expedient of being too solidly built to deteriorate gracefully, and a boarding house called the Anchor, which faced the inner harbor from the south side, and whose windows offered, in the late afternoon, a view of the waters so particular in its quality of light that several artists had taken rooms there over the years for the specific purpose of painting it, and several more had given up on the view and painted the harbor wall instead, which held still and was easier. Miss Marple had come to Halverton on a Thursday morning in October of 1937, arriving by the branch line and finding Halverton Station a single platform of the cheerful, wind-scoured sort that suggests the village beyond it will be smaller and more interesting than a larger station would have implied. She was met by Mrs. Agnes Finch, who had been her friend for 31 years, and who greeted her on the platform with the fond efficiency of someone who has been looking forward to a visit and has organized it accordingly. Mrs. Finch was 68, a widow of 6 years, small and direct, and possessed of the particular authority of women who have spent decades managing households that also contained the kind of professional husband who prefers to manage other things and leaves the household to someone more competent. Her late husband had been Halverton's harbor master for 22 years, which meant that Mrs. Finch knew everything about the harbor and a great deal about the sea, and had opinions about both that she did not keep to herself. She also had a nephew, Arthur Finch, who was 26 and worked as a customs clerk in the customs house on the North Quay, and who came for supper at the Anchor most Wednesdays and had done since he arrived in Halverton the previous year. He was a pleasant, earnest young man who took his work seriously in the way of young men who are new to a profession and have not yet learned which parts of it can be taken less seriously without consequences. He knew the manifests, the waybills, the cargo schedules, the shipping agent's papers, and the documentation of the SS Aldgate's arrival the previous Monday in the particular close, professional way of someone who has been over the paperwork several times that week and has found something in it that he finds interesting and does not quite know what to make of. He mentioned this at supper on Thursday evening, while the harbor showed its last light through the window, and Mrs. Finch's lamb chops achieved the standard she expected of them, which was high. He said, "There's an anomaly in the Aldgate manifest." He said it in the tone of someone raising a professional curiosity, not an alarm, the tone of someone at the early stage of a thing, before it has declared itself as one kind of thing or another. He said, "There's a crate listed twice, under 2 different entries. Same crate mark, same origin port, 2 different weights, 2 different consignee addresses. Looks like a clerical error. Happens sometimes with the carbons, someone copies from the wrong template, but it's an interesting error. Mrs. Finch said, "Interesting how?" He said, "The weight discrepancy is significant. The first entry has the crate at 42 pounds, which is consistent with the listed contents. Machinery parts, standard packing weight. The second entry has the same crate at 104 pounds. Mrs. Finch said, 62 pounds is a considerable penciling error. He said, "It is." He said it with the slight hesitation of someone who has thought about it and has not quite arrived at the next thought. Miss Marple looked at her lamb chop and said nothing. She filed the 62 pounds, the 2 consignee addresses, and the 2 entries for the same crate mark in the careful internal ledger she had been maintaining, without conscious decision, since she arrived in Halverton, and found that it was the kind of place where things were maintained in ledgers, for good reasons, and where the ledgers, if one paid attention, told a rather more complete story than the summary. She thought, a clerical error produces 1 entry too many, or a figure in the wrong column, or a transposed digit. It does not generally produce 2 complete consistent entries for the same physical object, with different weights, different destinations, and different paper trails. Those are not the marks of an error. They are the marks of a document doing 2 things at once. She set down her fork and asked Arthur, in the mild, interested way that rarely alarmed young men, whether she might have a look at the manifest when he had a moment. He said he could bring a copy around in the morning. She said that would be very kind. She went to bed with the sound of the harbor through the window, the particular harbor sound of rope and water and the low, rhythmic industry of a working dock that does not entirely stop at night. And she thought, for a while, before she went to sleep. Chapter 2. The Man on the Quay. It was the customs house's porter, a garrulous man called Norris, who brought the news to the anchor at 5:30 on Friday morning, which was very early even for Halverton, and caused Mrs. Finch to open the door in her housecoat with an expression that did not encourage garrulity, but received it anyway. Percy Stout, the ship's purser of the SS Aldgate, had been found on the south side of the cargo quay, in the narrow passage between the Aldgate's stern and the dock wall, at approximately 4:45. He had been found by one of the deck crew, who was going to check a mooring line that had been reported loose. He was dead. The immediate assessment of the town's doctor, who had been called at once and had arrived at 5 o'clock, was a head injury, consistent with a fall from the dock level above, or with contact with a sharp edge of dock infrastructure in a fall. The South Quay was a working area, not a public one, and the dock walls had enough projecting ironwork to make a fall in the dark a plausible explanation for the injury found. The police constable's initial instinct was accident. The harbor constable's initial instinct, which he kept to himself for the time being, was rather less settled. There was something in the position of the body, the angle, the specific placement, that suggested to him that something that had begun badly had been arranged afterward, though he could not yet say precisely how or by whom, and he had the good sense not to say so to anyone until he had thought about it more carefully. Miss Marple dressed and came downstairs and ate her breakfast with the methodical attentiveness she brought to meals on days when she expected to need her full attention for other things. Mrs. Finch joined her, and they discussed the news with the gravity it warranted. Arthur Finch arrived at 8 o'clock with the copy of the manifest, and the expression of a young man who has heard something distressing, and is finding that the distressing thing and the professional thing he had been thinking about the night before are beginning to connect in his mind in ways he does not yet want to fully articulate. He set the manifest on the kitchen table, and Miss Marple looked at it over her second cup of tea. The SS Aldgate was a tramp steamer of medium size that ran a route from Rotterdam to Lisbon, with regular stops at Halverton and 2 other south coast ports. She had been in and out of Halverton 3 or 4 times a year for the past 6 years, in the ordinary, unspectacular way of vessels that carry ordinary, unspectacular cargo. The manifest was 22 pages of typed entries, each entry noting the crate or bale identification mark, the origin port, the contents description, the weight, the consignee name, and the consignee address. The typing was clean and regular, the product of an efficient purser's office. On page 14, there was the anomaly Arthur had described. A crate marked with the Aldgate standard shipping prefix and the number 7A appeared twice. First entry, 42 pounds, machinery parts, consignee name of a hardware dealer in Halverton called Pemberton's, consignee address of Market Street. Second entry, 2 entries lower on the same page, 104 pounds, machinery parts, consignee name of a firm called Harrow & Croft Limited, consignee address, 14 Kelvin Wharf, Bristol. She looked at both entries carefully. She said, "Arthur, the consignee address for the second entry, Kelvin Wharf in Bristol, are you familiar with it?" He said he wasn't, off the top of his head. She said, "It would be worth checking." She said it in the neutral tone of someone making a practical suggestion rather than a significant observation, and returned to her tea. She did not say at this point what she noticed about the weight of the second entry versus the first. She did not say what she had thought about, in the harbor sound dark of the Anchor's second floor, before she went to sleep. She filed it, and said nothing, because she had only one piece of what she suspected was a rather larger puzzle. And saying things prematurely, she had found, tended to close doors that were best left open. The suspects assembled themselves naturally in the course of the morning, in the way that the relevant people in any small, closed professional community assemble around an event that concerns them, because there is nowhere else to be. Captain Dougal Macpherson of the SS Aldgate was 58, a large and taciturn Scotsman who wore his reticence with the comfortable permanence of someone who has been reticent since childhood, and has never found it necessary to revise the habit. He came ashore at 9 o'clock for his meeting with the harbor authorities and the police constable, and he spoke to both parties with the minimum content compatible with cooperation, and returned aboard at 11, where he was understood to remain for the remainder of the day. He had known Stout for 9 years. He had found him, as pursers went, reliable and thorough. He said nothing else about this, and answered no further questions on the subject without the specific prompt of a direct question, and even then, economically. Mr. Sidney Ashby, the shipping agent for Halverton, appeared at the customs house at 9:30 to inquire about the documentation procedures for the Aldgate's cargo, as was normal practice when a ship was in port and cargo was being worked. He was 50, compact and well-dressed in the prosperous manner of a small-town professional who has been successful for long enough that the success has become the natural state of things. He had been Halverton's shipping agent for 12 years, and was regarded, as far as Miss Marple could ascertain from Mrs. Finch and from the general ambient information of a harbor town, as competent, reliable, and pleasant. He was known. He had known Stout from Stout's 6 years of regular Aldgate arrivals. He said, in the course of the morning's various conversations, that the death was dreadful, and that Stout had been a careful, professional man, and it was very hard to understand. He said this with the controlled, appropriate sadness of someone who is genuinely sad and is managing the degree to which the sadness is visible, which was, to Miss Marple's observation, a slightly more managed performance than the occasion strictly required. Mr. Leonard Blades, the senior customs officer, was 45, and he was frightened. He was not frightened in the dramatic sense of a man who fears immediate personal danger. He was frightened in the deeper, more specific sense of a man who knows something he should not know, and is aware that the knowing of it is about to become relevant in ways he cannot entirely predict or control. He did his work with the precise, competent correctness of someone who is concentrating extra hard on the visible things, so as to avoid thinking about the invisible ones. And he did not look at Sidney Ashby when Ashby was in the room, and Ashby did not look at him, and this mutual avoidance was, to the watching eye, louder than speech. Chapter 3. A Clerical Error. Arthur brought the manifest around to the anchor at noon, as arranged, and they sat at the kitchen table with Mrs. Finch's good coffee, and the pages spread between them, and Miss Marple looked at the document with the close, interested attention she had promised herself since Thursday evening. She had been in harbour towns before, though not often in a professional capacity. She knew enough about shipping documents from a long acquaintance with people whose lives had been adjacent to maritime trade, a nephew who had spent years in the merchant navy, a cousin's husband who had managed cargo insurance, the particular texture of knowledge one acquires from knowing people rather than studying subjects, to read a manifest with reasonable comprehension. She knew what the columns meant. She knew what a standard entry looked like. She knew, therefore, what an entry that was not quite standard looked like when she saw one. She went through the manifest page by page, with Arthur summarizing each section and answering her occasional questions with the patient helpfulness of a young man who is glad to have something useful to do in a difficult morning. On page 14, she stopped and looked at the anomalous entries again, now with the full document's context to work with. The weight discrepancy she had already noted, 42 pounds versus 104. She thought, 62 pounds. A crate of machinery parts of the size implied by a 42-pound entry would typically be of a certain dimension. A crate of the same marked size, but weighing 104 pounds, would need to contain something considerably denser than the stated contents, or something considerably larger, which would alter the outer dimensions in a way that could not be masked from anyone actually handling the crate. She thought, or something that breathes. She thought it and set it aside and did not say it. She was not yet certain enough. She said, Arthur, the consignee in the second entry, Harrow and Croft Limited, 14 Kelvin Wharf, Bristol. Did you have an opportunity to check? He had. He had telephoned the Bristol Chamber of Commerce that morning. There was no Harrow and Croft Limited registered at any address in Bristol. There was no Kelvin Wharf in Bristol. She said, and the consignee in the first entry? Pemberton's Hardware, Market Street? He said, yes, old firm. They've been on Market Street for 40 years. The Aldgate brings them small machinery fittings twice a year. The crate's real, she said, so one entry for this crate marks is real, and one is not. The real one exists because the crate exists, and its contents are what they say they are. The second entry exists to document a second identity for the same crate, a false identity, with a false destination and a false consignee. She said it calmly, because it was the most useful way to say things that were not calm at all, and she watched Arthur's face process the implication, which took perhaps 10 seconds. She said, I wonder whether it might be worthwhile to note which entry appears to have been typed at the same time as the rest of the manifest, and which appears to have been added afterward. He looked at the page again, and this time he looked at it as someone looking for what she had suggested, and after a moment he said, slowly, the second entry has slightly different margins from the entries around it, and the top face is the same, but the alignment is off. It's like it was typed on the same machine but not in the same sitting, not from the same starting position. She said, I think that is very likely exactly what it is. She closed the manifest and said she thought she would take a walk along the quay, if he didn't mind, and look at the harbour. Chapter 4. The Captain's Table. The boarding-house's dining room served supper to its guests at 7, and on Friday evening the guests included, in addition to Miss Marple and Mrs. Finch, 3 men with business at the harbour, a timber buyer from Exeter whose ship had been delayed, a marine insurance surveyor who was there about an unrelated matter, and Sidney Ashby, who had taken a room at the Anchor for the duration of the Aldgate's unloading rather than commuting daily from his house in the town. This last arrangement struck Miss Marple, when Mrs. Finch mentioned it at tea, as somewhat more convenient for her purposes than she could reasonably have arranged herself. She had wanted to observe Sidney Ashby in an informal setting, and here was an informal setting, and here was Sidney Ashby, and all that was required of her was to be present at supper and to be pleasant, which was not difficult. He was pleasant in return. He was a man who had been pleasant professionally for 12 years, and had the social fluency that comes from long practice. The easy question, the attentive response, the small appropriate joke, the interest that is warm enough to engage without being intense enough to demand. He talked about the harbor, about the Aldgate schedule, about the various complications that arose when cargo was being worked in uncertain weather. He did not mention Percy Stout directly, but referred once briefly to the awful business of the morning, with the appropriate tone of a man who worked with the man and is genuinely affected. What he did not do over the course of a 90-minute supper was sit still. His hands moved constantly, not nervously, not in the way of a man who is visibly agitated, but with the habitual quality of someone who is accustomed to occupying his hands, and is doing so now because stillness, in the current circumstances, would require an effort of will he is not prepared to make. He refilled his own water glass 3 times, adjusted his fork twice without eating from it, and turned his bread roll over once before putting it down. Finch, who had spent 30 years observing people at harbor tables and was not easily deceived about what the hands were doing when the voice was saying something else, caught Miss Marple's eye once across the table and said nothing, which is sometimes the most informative thing a person can say. Captain Macpherson came to the anchor at 8 o'clock, not as a guest, but on some errand connected with the Port Authority's paperwork, and sat with Sidney Ashby in the small parlor off the dining room for 20 minutes. Miss Marple did not hear this conversation. She heard, through the partially open door, the particular quality of 2 men's voices discussing something that required a consistent story, which is a different quality from 2 men simply talking. The pauses fell in different places than they do in ordinary conversation. The words came with the slight additional care of words that are being checked before release. She finished her coffee and went upstairs, and she thought about Captain Macpherson, who had everything the circumstantial case required of a suspect: access, authority, motive from the financial difficulties that Mrs. Finch's harbor knowledge had established, and who was, she thought, probably not the person she was looking for. She thought the person she was looking for was the person who had added the second entry to the manifest. The second entry had been typed on the same machine as the rest, but not in the same sitting. Typed, therefore, by someone with access to the purser's typewriter and the manifest template. That was not a shoreside person. That was someone aboard the ship, or someone who had boarded it. She thought, and the person who had asked Stout to stay quiet, or had warned him to stay quiet, or had discovered that Stout intended not to stay quiet, that person had been on the dock that afternoon. She thought about Leonard Blades, who had not looked at Sidney Ashby at supper. She thought about Sidney Ashby, whose hands would not be still. Chapter 5. The Impossible Address. She went back to the manifest on Saturday morning, with Arthur's permission, and the copy he had left at the anchor the previous day. And she went through it again, with the particular patience of the second reading, which is always more productive than the first, because the first reading establishes the map, and the second reading can notice what is not on it. The consignee address for the second entry, 14 Kelvin Wharf, Bristol. There was no Kelvin Wharf in Bristol. She had established this. A consignee address that does not exist is not a typographical error. A typographical error produces a real address misspelled, or a real number on a real street, or a transposition of digits in a real postcode. A non-existent address is an invented one, and invented addresses are invented for specific purposes. The shipping date recorded in the second entry, Tuesday the 5th. The first entry carried the correct date of Wednesday the 6th, which was the day the crate had been loaded at Rotterdam, confirmed by the Rotterdam port documentation that Arthur had checked. The second entry was dated 1 day earlier, the 5th, which was the day the Aldgate had been in port at Antwerp, where she had stopped for 18 hours on her way from Rotterdam. A crate loaded in Rotterdam on Wednesday cannot have been entered on the manifest at Antwerp on Tuesday. The shipping date in the second entry recorded an impossibility, which meant it had been recorded by someone who did not know the precise schedule of the ship's preceding movements, or who knew them but had made an error in the false chronology, which amounted to the same thing. She noted this. She set it beside the non-existent address, and the weight discrepancy, and the separately typed entry, and she looked at the four things arranged together, and she found that what they composed, taken as a group rather than individually, was not a series of errors. A system designed to do one thing, to create a paper identity for a crate that would route it through the customs process as though its contents were declared machinery parts bound for a legitimate destination in Bristol, while its actual contents, whatever the actual contents were, arrived at Halverton unchecked. She said none of this to Arthur, who would have been obliged, as a customs officer, to report it immediately, which would have started a process that Miss Marple was not yet ready to start. She thanked him for the use of the document, and suggested he might find it useful, in the course of his ordinary work, to look into the question of why a consignee address in Bristol failed to appear in any official registry. She said it as a professional suggestion, one colleague to another, and went to have lunch. She had been in the dining room for approximately 10 minutes when Blades came in. He was not there for lunch. He stood at the entrance for a moment, with the look of a man who has come to do something and is deciding whether to do it. And then he sat down opposite her, without being invited, and said, without preamble, that he needed to speak to someone who was not the constable. She said, "I see." She said, "Shall I order you something to eat?" He said no. He said with the directness of someone who has been working up to this for 24 hours, and has now arrived at the only version that will come out. He had received money from Sidney Ashby 6 months ago, a sum of money, he named it, it was not large, to not look too closely at a particular crate during the unloading inspection. He had not been told what was in the crate. He had been told it was a private matter, and that the documentation was in order, and that his inspection did not need to extend to a physical check of the contents. He said, "He told me it was business goods, samples, something that didn't travel well through normal channels because of the paperwork." He said it the way Ashby said things, sensibly, reassuringly, as though the thing was perfectly ordinary, and the minor irregularity was a technicality being managed by the right people. I told myself I believed him. He said, and then yesterday, Percy Stout died on the dock, in circumstances that didn't look like an accident to me, even when the constable was treating it as one. And last night, I couldn't sleep. She said, "You will need to tell the constable. Not this afternoon necessarily. I understand, you need time to arrange yourself for it. But soon, and completely." He said, "Yes, I know." She said, "Was there anything in what Mr. Ashby told you 6 months ago that suggested what the private matter was?" He said, slowly, "He said the documentation was in order." He said it twice, the way people say things twice when they want the phrase to carry weight. Chapter 6. What the Stevedore Heard. She found the man through Mrs. Finch, who knew everyone connected with the harbor, in the detailed, specific way of someone who had been married to its administrator for 22 years, and had not spent those years looking at the wall. His name was Gideon Rowe, and he had been working the South Quay as a dock laborer for 11 years, and he had been on the quay on Friday afternoon during the period that mattered. She spoke to him at the harbor side on Saturday afternoon, in the company of Mrs. Finch, and the specific permission of the harbor constable, who had by that point been informed of Blades's account by Blades himself, and was now rather more alert to what Friday afternoon might have contained. Rowe was a quiet man, not given to elaboration, with the directness of someone who describes things as he saw them, without interpretation and without embellishment, which was, for Miss Marple's purposes, exactly the most useful quality. He said, "I was working the line at the forward hatch, late afternoon, maybe 3:15. I heard raised voices from the direction of the agent's shed, the small one at the south end of the quay, the one Ashby uses for the paperwork when he's working a ship. I didn't think much about it at first. Voices carry on the quay, especially with wind from the south. He said, but I know the purser's voice, Stout's voice. He's been coming in and out of Halverton for years. Particular way of speaking, very clear, like a man who's used to being heard over noise. And I heard his voice from that direction at 3:15, raise, which I'd never heard from him before. He was a quiet man, not a shouter. Miss Marple said, and the other voice? He said, I couldn't hear the words, just the tone. The other voice was quieter, much quieter, almost like the opposite of Stout's, but it wasn't a backing down quiet. It was a thinking quiet, a managing quiet. She said, and after? Stout came out of the direction of the shed a few minutes later, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 7, walking toward the dock proper, the south side, moving quick, not running, moving the way a man moves when he's decided something. I saw the back of him. That was the last I saw. She said, and the other person? He said, I didn't see. The shed is around the corner from where I was working. I heard a door. I didn't see. She thanked him and said he had been very helpful, and that she thought the constable would want to speak to him, if he was willing. He said he was. She walked back to the anchor with Mrs. Finch in the comfortable silence of two women who have known each other for 30 years, and do not need to fill the space between them with words. She thought about a managing quiet, about a man who argues quietly and at length and in private, and then waits until the other person has left, and then follows. Chapter 7. The Second Name. She asked Arthur on Sunday morning to let her look at the manifest one more time, and she looked at it with the reading glass she had brought for the journey. In the good morning light of the customs house's east-facing window, which Arthur opened to let the sea air in. The second entry for crate 7A had its own small signature at the bottom right of the entry column, the initialing of the officer who had passed the entry as documentation complete. She looked at it with the glass. The initials read, P.S. Percy Stout. But Percy Stout's hand, which she had been given several examples of from the manifest's other pages, his annotations, his correction marks, his notation in the margin on page 19 of a wake query he had raised, had a particular quality. He wrote his P with an enclosed loop, a closed circle for the bowl of the letter. The initial on the second entry had an open P, the loop not closed, the stroke returning to the stem before completing the circle. It was a small difference. It was not the difference between one man's P and another man's P that you would notice without a reason to look. It was the difference you noticed when you were looking precisely because you suspected it was there. She set the glass down and thought. If Stout had not signed the second entry, then someone had signed it in his name. Whoever had added the second entry to the manifest had also forged Stout's initial to authenticate it. Whoever had access to the manifest and a typewriter and the specific knowledge of how the entries were formatted also had the nerve to sign a document in a dead man's hand, except that Stout had not been dead when the entry was signed. He had been alive and working the ship. The second entry had been added at some point during the voyage, or perhaps in port, and Stout's initial had been forged to make it look authenticated. But Stout had known. Stout had known about the second entry, because the second entry was the thing he had been looking at since 9 o'clock on Thursday morning. The thing that had caused him to watch the crate rock under the stevedore's hook with the particular attention of a man whose professional certainty and his growing moral certainty are moving toward the same point. He had not raised an alarm immediately. He had waited, watched, thought. He had then gone to speak to Sidney Ashby privately on Friday afternoon, in the agent's shed on the South Quay, with the decisive walk of a man who has made up his mind. He had gone to tell Ashby that he knew, and Ashby had followed him to the dock, and in the noise and confusion of the late afternoon unloading, the crane, the winch, the shouts of the gang, the wind off the harbor, whatever had happened between the agent's shed and the south dock wall had happened quickly and in the middle of noise, and been attributed without great difficulty to a working accident. She thought about the second entry, and what it had been designed to do. She thought about a crate marked at 42 pounds that weighed 104 pounds when it swung from the stevedore's hook. She thought about 62 additional pounds, 62 pounds that breathed, that consumed oxygen, that needed over the course of a voyage from Rotterdam to Devon, a certain careful management that only the people who knew about it could provide. She thought the duplicate entry was not smuggling goods, it was smuggling a person. She thought about 1937 and about Rotterdam and about who in 1937 might need to leave a European port city on a cargo ship without a passenger manifest entry, bound for England, in a crate rated for machinery parts that arrived in Halverton before the manifest could be formally reconciled with customs. She thought about Marta Brenner, whom she did not yet know by name, and she thought whoever arranged this was not merely a criminal doing business. They were doing something that someone needed very badly, for reasons that had nothing to do with profit and everything to do with survival. She went to find the constable, and then Sidney Ashby. Chapter 8. Mr. Ashby's Errand. The constable had, by Sunday morning, assembled enough from Blades's account and Rowe's account and the harbour authorities' questions about the South Quay circumstances, to know that the Friday death was considerably more complicated than his initial instinct had allowed, and to have telegraphed for an inspector from the county town, who arrived on Sunday afternoon and found that quite a lot of the preliminary work had been done by the time he got there. Sidney Ashby was asked to come to the customs house at 3 o'clock. He came with the composed willingness of someone who has decided, between Saturday night and Sunday afternoon, how he intends to conduct himself. He sat across the table from the inspector, with his hands folded before him, and his face in an arrangement of concerned cooperation that had the quality of a performance that has been rehearsed. Miss Marple sat to the side of the room, where she had been placed by the inspector at the specific suggestion of Arthur Finch, who had told the inspector, with the honesty of someone who has thought carefully about what is useful, that she had been looking at the manifest since Thursday, and had found several things that the inspector might find it helpful to have explained by someone who understood them. The inspector laid out what they had: the manifest discrepancy, both entries, the weight difference, the non-existent address, the impossible date, the forged initial, the borrowed money transaction with Blades, as Blades had described it, Rowe's account of the voices in the agent's shed on Friday afternoon, the timeline from shed to dock. Ashby listened to this without interruption. He listened with the focused attention of a man making a precise assessment of what is provable and what is not, and what is provable about one thing and what is provable about another. When the inspector finished, Ashby said with the considered calm of a prepared statement, he was not in a position to discuss the documentation matters without his solicitor present, and he would appreciate the opportunity to telephone. Miss Marple said, "Of course." She said it without particular inflection, and then she said, "I wonder whether I might ask one question before the telephone call, not about the documentation, but about something adjacent." She said it in the mild way she asked questions that were not mild at all. Ashby looked at her. He had been looking at her since she came into the room, with the steady, assessing attention of a man who cannot quite determine what she is, and whether her presence is consequential. He said, "If you like." She said, "The crate. Crate 7A. The crate that appears twice on page 14. I wonder whether you can tell me, not who was responsible for the entries. We'll leave that question. But who was inside it? Not what was inside it, who." The room was very quiet. The inspector had the sense to be still. Ashby's hands, which had been folded on the table, did not move. But something in the quality of his stillness changed, the stillness of a man who has been very still and is now very much stiller, which is a different thing. He said after a long moment, "I think I had better speak to my solicitor." She said, "Yes, I thought so. But I want to tell you what I believe is true, before you do, so that you know what I know." She said, "There was a person in that crate, a young woman, I think. The weight suggests one adult. The management of the voyage suggests someone whose presence was protected by at least one member of the crew, who knew she was there, and attended to her need for air and water during the crossing. She arrived in Halverton not as a passenger, but as cargo, because arriving as a passenger for this particular person in October 1937 was not possible. She is in England now. She is safe. And the manifest was designed to make that possible, to create a paper identity for the crate that would route it through the inspection process without the crate being opened. She said, Mr. Stout found the discrepancy on Thursday morning. He spent most of Thursday understanding what it meant, and most of Thursday night deciding what to do about it. On Friday afternoon, he came to find you in the agent's shed. He told you he had found it, and he told you what he intended to do. She said, what he intended to do, I think, was not to immediately report it. I think he came to tell you what he knew, and to give you the opportunity to explain it to him, because he was a careful man, and a fair one, and he did not wish to report something of this complexity without understanding it. He was giving you the chance to tell him the truth. Ashby did not answer this. She said, and whatever you told him in that shed, he left it with a decision made, and you followed him. She said it plainly, without emphasis and without accusation, in the tone of someone stating what she knows to be true. And then she said nothing more, and the inspector took over, and the solicitor was sent for, and the mechanism of justice began its slow and inevitable assembly. Ashby, in the end, did not contest the facts. He contested several things about the interpretation of the facts, with the thorough assistance of his solicitor over several subsequent days. But the facts themselves, the manifest, the money to Blades, Rowe's account of the shed, the physical evidence of the dock wall's ironwork, he did not contest. He could not. What he said when he said anything that was not directed by the solicitor was, she would have died. He said it simply, without appeal, as one states a fact that is not open to negotiation. He said, her family contacted me in June. They had connections in Rotterdam through a shipping firm I'd worked with before the war, and they needed someone at the English end, a route that didn't go through passenger channels and didn't require papers that no one was going to issue to a Jewish family's daughter in the summer of 1937. I am not going to pretend the money they paid me was not part of it. It was, but she would have died. He said Stout was a good man. He was the best purser I had ever worked with in 12 years. He came to that shed because he wanted to understand it, not to report it. He told me he was not going to pretend he hadn't seen it, but he was willing to wait 24 hours while I made a telephone call and confirmed that the girl was safe. 24 hours, that was all he asked. And he stopped. He said, I was not thinking about 24 hours. I was thinking about everything that was going to happen afterward, and whether I could manage it, and whether I could afford it. And I was wrong. I was wrong about all of it. And he is dead, and that is the truth of what I am. Chapter 9. The Harbour at Dusk. The inspector went, and Arthur went, and Mrs. Finch made tea for the two of them in the kitchen at the Anchor, and they sat with the harbour visible through the window, the low October light going orange on the water, and the sound of the Aldgate's winch still working somewhere on the north side. Miss Marple said, after a while, Marta Brenner is somewhere in England tonight. Mrs. Finch said, yes. She said it in the tone of a woman who understands this fact, and is not yet sure how to hold it alongside the other facts of the evening. The inspector had been informed. The question of the young woman who had arrived in England in a cargo crate in October 1937 was going to be a more complicated question than the murder, in some ways, because it involved papers and authorities and the particular bureaucratic machinery of a country that had not yet decided precisely what it thought about the people arriving at its shores from an increasingly dangerous part of Europe. It would be handled. It would, Miss Marple trusted, be handled with more compassion than haste, by people in a position to make it go quietly and correctly. She did not know this for certain. She trusted it, which was the best available position. She thought about what Sidney Ashby had done. She thought about it in its two separate parts, which could not be combined into a single moral judgment without doing violence to both. He had arranged the passage of a young woman from Rotterdam to England, in conditions that were uncomfortable and frightening, and without the standard protections that passengers are afforded, because the standard protections were not available to her. He had been paid for this, which did not diminish the act, but did complicate it. He had risked a great deal, his business, his freedom, his standing in a town where he had built 12 years of professional reputation, to do it. And he had, in a moment of fear and miscalculation that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and covered perhaps 15 yards of dock, killed a man who had asked only for 24 hours. It will address the first fact more gently than the second, which is, on the whole, correct. She did not know how gently. She hoped gently enough. She thought about Percy Stout, who had been meticulous and careful and fair, and who had extended to Ashby a courtesy that Ashby had repaid with panic and violence, and who had died for the quality of his own decency, which is among the worst things the world does. She thought about this for a while, and then she set it aside, because keeping it was not useful, and she had no way to address it. She thought about small deceptions that are made necessary by large cruelties, and about the particular moral position of someone who does a thing that is both protective and wrong, and about whether the wrongness of one cancels the protectiveness of the other. She thought, it does not cancel it. They exist simultaneously, both real, and the law handles the one it was designed to handle, and leaves the other to whoever is doing the thinking, which is the arrangement it has always had with conscience. She thought about Marta Brenner, 28 years old, who was somewhere in England tonight, which she had not been 6 weeks ago, and which had required the death of a good man to make possible, which it should not have, and which the person responsible for the death would spend however long the law gave him thinking about. The harbour went dark slowly, in the particular Devon fashion of harbour dusks, which are long and warm even in October, and which have a quality of reluctant transition, as though the light is willing to stay a little longer, if asked properly. The Aldgate's winch stopped. A gull called somewhere out over the water, once, and then was quiet. The last of the orange left the surface of the harbour, and the water went to pewter and then to dark, and the lights of the custom-house came on across the way, and Mrs. Finch refilled the teacups, and they sat together in the way of old friends who have spent a difficult day and have arrived at the point where simply sitting is what there is. Miss Marple thought, there are secrets worth keeping. She had believed this for a long time, had arrived at it slowly, through the particular education of watching people keep and fail to keep secrets over many years. There are secrets that are kept for good reasons, to protect someone, to shelter someone, to stand between a person and a harm that has not yet arrived, but will arrive if the secret is not maintained. And there are secrets that are kept for reasons that were good and have curdled, or that were never good and were only comfortable, or that began as protection and ended as control. The difficulty she had found is that they are not always distinguishable from the outside, and are sometimes not distinguishable from the inside, and the distinction is the one that matters most. She thought, Marta Brenner's secret had been worth keeping. The method of keeping it had not been. That was the most honest thing she could say, and she said it to no one in particular. And the harbour was dark, and the tea was warm, and it was, in the end, enough. And that is the story of the SS Aldgate, the cargo manifest, and the crate that appeared twice on page 14. I've been sitting with the question I asked you at the beginning. Is there a secret you believe is worth keeping, not for yourself, but for someone else, someone who can't protect themselves? Tonight's story has stayed with me, because it doesn't allow a clean answer. The secret was worth keeping, the method was not. The person who kept it did something genuinely humane, and in the same breath, something genuinely terrible. And those two things don't resolve into one another. They just both remain, and you have to hold them together. And that holding is what Miss Marple is doing in that kitchen with her tea, and what I've been doing since I first heard this story. Leave your answer in the comments. Tell me what you think. If you've ever kept a secret for someone else, or chosen not to, I would honestly like to know. Midnight Pages is where stories like this one live. If you're new here, subscribe, so the next one finds you. They are not all this complicated. This is David. Good night from Ohio. May the secrets you carry be ones you chose, and may they be worth the carrying.